This film is based on the EU Cost Action FP0905 training school on plant genome modification and the regulatory framework for GM plants in Europe, held at the University of Tromsø, Norway, from the 29th of April to the 1st of May 2013. The training school provided early-stage researchers from all over Europe with state-of-the-art insight into techniques for plant genome modification, as well as the regulatory implications of the commercial use of such techniques in Europe. The EU Cost Action FP0905 focuses on genetically modified plants and trees in particular. First, let's talk with Antoine Harfouche, a professor at the University of Tuscia, Italy, and former director of scientific business development at Futura Gene in West Lafayette, USA. What motivates research on GM trees? And what type of products are currently in development?
GM research in forest trees is motivated by the need to support tree breeding programs and to develop diagnostic tools for their conservation and restoration. Besides, in light of impending water, arable land shortages, growth population, and climate change, it is more important than ever to accelerate tree breeding programs. For example, a single cycle of genetic improvement of pine requires almost 30 years for completion. Incorporating genome-wide selection will definitely improve its efficiency by reducing the cycle to almost 5 years.
What is happening in Europe?
Well, a lot of research is happening in the EU. Recently, the EU has funded a large-scale collaborative research project which is aimed to develop bioenergy crops and trees that they can be grown on marginal lands and water-stressed environments for biofuel and bioproducts. This is a very interesting approach that can lead to develop those bioenergy crops for bioenergy and biofuel, so we can rely more on the second-generation biofuel, which is non-food biomass, rather than using food crops for biofuels.
As we heard from Professor Harfouche, many new products are being planned and are in different developmental stages. Several have reached field testing. Field testing is the growth of plants on limited open areas after national approval for the purpose of research and data collection. Let's hear more from Dr. Bert Glandorf. She is an experienced senior risk assessor at RIVM in Bilthoven, the Netherlands. What is needed to get a regulatory approval in Europe?
If you want to get regulatory approval for commercial growth of GM trees in Europe, you need to collect enough data on your GM trees and their performance. And for that, you need to do field trials, preferentially in the EU member states where you want to grow your GM trees. As an applicant in each of these member states, then you have to apply for these field trials. And you have to do that under the European Directive 2001/18. And in each of the EU member states, you have to get approval to grow your specific GM tree. Then you do your trials to collect data on the performance of the trees, but especially also to see if there are no adverse environmental effects resulting from the growth of your GM trees. And after a couple of years, when you have collected enough data, you can apply for a European market application, and you can do that either under 2001/18 at a specific EU member state who will do the first assessment, or you can apply with EFSA under Regulation 80/29.
In other parts of the world, GM trees are considered developed for open release into the environment. However, in Europe, due to strict regulations and limited utility, GM trees are likely to be grown only on dedicated land or plantations and in horticulture. Thus, we are unlikely to see GM trees in European forests. The public has expressed some concern and reservation regarding GM plant products in Europe. There are many opinions as to the value of GM technology in plant breeding. These perspectives can also be found among students. Let's hear what a few of the students attending the training school have to say. What have you learned in this training school?
So when you are a scientist, the more you do research, the more you do master, PhD, go on and on to be a professor. And so you normally deal with a very complex system, and you have the organism, you have your methods, your approach. And when you change things and you start working with the GMO plant, then you deal with something that one day you want it to be out there. And then you need to understand a lot more about environment, its interaction with the environment, with the ecological system. We talked about birds and insects and microorganisms and so many things that normally you don't really need to deal with them. And from this training school I actually learned what is the approach of risk assessment, what are the answers they need to know. So while you take that step, you need to understand that you are taking much more responsibility, and you need to know a lot more in order to be able to give better answers. It gave me a very wide knowledge of the problems that can come up.
Now let's turn to the regulatory implications of GM plants in Europe. As we heard from Bert Glandorf, there are both directives and regulations in place that govern the use of such products. Every product intended to be introduced into the European marketplace needs to undergo a comprehensive risk assessment. Let's hear what one of the leading experts on risk assessment in Europe, Dr. Detlef Bartsch, has to say on this topic. What are the environmental concerns being discussed?
The environmental concerns about genetically modified trees are mostly related to the new traits that are now possible to be introduced. So it's a concern about the differences between trees, normal trees, and now genetically modified trees. This relates to persistence and invasiveness. This means how they behave in the long term, whether they stay at their site or they spread into different environments. Another concern would be whether there is an impact on non-target organisms. One other more theoretical reason is whether these soil organisms may be affected if there is a trait expressed in these trees, and these roots may influence the soil differently than normal trees.
Outside Europe, different emphasis and views on the utility of GM technology for tree breeding have led to a different product range emerging. Let's hear the perspectives of Professor Gert Bossinger, a well-known tree researcher from Melbourne, Australia.
One of the questions that has to be answered is the one of regulation of the controlled release of genetically manipulated trees, both for experimental and for commercial applications. And in order to discuss this type of regulation, the European Union has put together, under the Collaboration in Science and Technology scheme, the COST scheme, a working group that is looking at unifying and determining special considerations that have to be made for the particular use of transgenic forestry crops. For me as a scientist working in this particular field, coming from Australia, it is very interesting and informative to see how this process of consensus finding across all the countries in the European Communion works, which is presenting both challenges and wonderful opportunities as well.
Let's hear more from Dr. Jeremy Sweet from the UK about the characteristics of GM trees.
GM trees are different from other crop plants because they have certain features which you don't find in other crops. The feature of GM trees, or the features that we have to think about, are the fact that they are very long-lived. They have very slow reproductive cycles. They tend to occur in a forest situation or a plantation situation, and not in farmers' fields. And of course, the trees that we are cultivating are very similar to wild trees, and there can be gene flow from the cultivated trees into the wild trees. So we have to think about all these special features when we're doing the risk assessment of GM trees. There will be a problem, of course, particularly with this issue of the long life cycle, and the fact that often it takes several years for them to start producing flowers and seeds.
What should we expect in the European marketplace in the near future?
At the moment, there are very few GM trees approaching commercialization in Europe. So we're not really expecting any applications immediately, but there may be one or two coming through within the next few years. And then of course they would go into the EU regulatory system, and what will be interesting to see is to see how the regulatory system will deal with them. First of all, there will have to be a risk assessment by EFSA, and EFSA so far hasn't given any opinions on GM trees. That it will take several years for the first GM trees to go through the European regulatory system. So I'm not expecting any GM trees within the immediate future.
To sum up, technology to genetically modify plants is now emerging. These technologies are likely to be used in combination with traditional plant breeding techniques to develop novel GM tree varieties. The goals of such breeding may be improved biomass production, pest control, or better quality traits. For these products to be approved in Europe, they will have to undergo extensive risk assessment as laid out in the guidance documents produced by the European Food Safety Authority. The next early stage researcher training school for cost action FP0905 is planned to take place in Portugal in spring 2014.